Hi, we continue in 1 Samuel 15 today, and in this conversation between Samuel and Saul, between Saul and Samuel, we're probably hearing more about the characterization of these two people than we are about the actual will of Yahweh, the God of Israel, throughout this section. And to highlight that, I'm going to show a couple of ways in which the language that Samuel uses to chastise Saul, the language of listening to Yahweh and the language of sacrifice, is internally inconsistent in a number of ways that highlights that Samuel is simply trying to get Saul to listen to his voice as much as to any other voice. And when Saul won't, Samuel uses his last power over him to take the monarchy away. And we're going to have to look at it closely because it's a curious phenomenon, as the writers often do, to use the very thing that the characters are struggling with, which is how to listen carefully, on the readers. So as we, whether readers or hearers of these texts, if we don't listen carefully, then we can miss what the story is as well. So as you can see on the right side of the screen, we've been following throughout this section of videos all the way from chapter 11 through chapter 15. We're on this final scene here, and now we're on this last part of this of Samuel's confrontation with Saul. And as we've been looking throughout chapter 15, our unit on the right side here is parallel in many ways to what we saw in chapter 13, when Samuel told Saul to do what he said in terms of waiting for him 7 days in Gilgal before offering sacrifice. And so as we've been looking throughout chapter 15, I've been comparing this in terms of the four color-coded sections here. We've looked at the red part, Samuel's initial command in both, the blue part, what Saul did, the purple part, Samuel's response to Saul, and then the green part, Saul's defense. And so we looked at the beginning of this purple part, and now we're on this part here, starting with this purple, and then we're going to continue into this as well. We've also been looking at the key words, and as I noted last time, in the section we were on, the key words that are found throughout this, each color-coded, were coming together in this section where Yahweh spoke to Samuel about regretting making Saul king. So we see all the different colors brought here. So now we're coming down, we did this section here, and now we're coming down to this section, which is part of Samuel's speech, but the key words that we're going to look at today really come up here. This listening to the voice, the things utterly devoted to destruction. You see how many times the question of listening there throughout this section. Sacrifice was not one of the key words because it's really only in this immediate section, so I have a different chart for how to look at that. One more thing as we get started here. Important, as we'll see in verse 18, is Samuel says to Saul that Yahweh sent you, Saul, on a mission. Literally, Baderek, as we'll see, away. And it's important to be paying attention to where that mission was. It was to get the Amalekites way down here. Saul's headquarters was up here in Gibeah, up here, and Samuel's in Ramah up here, and in Gilgal, as we've also seen, where the monarchy was made. And so the preceding events were all taking place in this relatively small area with the Philistines on the edge here. But they had to go all the way down here to pursue the Amalekites and then chase them, and then they swoop on the spoil on the way back. And as I was highlighting in that scene, it certainly seems like the most immediate reason for the troops to swoop on the spoil is because they're hungry. And yet Saul will offer a different explanation that does not help him any here, as we'll see. So as we are paying attention to this, I want to bring up the last tool I'm going to use here. And this is to pull this together through the entire encounter between Saul and Samuel, all the way back to chapter 8 when the people asked for a king. So a couple of things about listening. The black bolded parts here are listening to the people. And so we saw it started with Yahweh telling Samuel to listen to the people multiple times here. And he had listened to the people, so we see 5 times in the initial set, 5 times the initial section, and then again in chapter 12, where Samuel confirms to Israel, I have listened to you. But then what he tells them is, listen to Yahweh. So Samuel has listened to Yahweh, who told him to listen to the people, but now he tells them to listen to Yahweh. And we see the purple listening to the words of Yahweh throughout here. But in the end, in a passage we'll look at in our next video, Saul will say to Samuel, I feared the people and listened to their voice. But one of the things we've been looking at is, and scholars have disagreed about this, is it a good or a bad thing for the king to listen to the voice of the people? Should the king be above the people, just simply listening directly to Yahweh and paying no attention to the people, much like many Middle Eastern kings or imperial leaders who are far distant from the people? Or is the kingship as reluctant as Samuel was to authorize the kingship in the first place? Yahweh allowed it. Would it be one in which Saul is listening to Yahweh and to the people to find out what they want? When Saul didn't listen to the people around the question of the honey, the people sided with Jonathan, and Saul was all alone there. And we didn't hear what Yahweh had to say about that at all. So that's a question we need to look at. Also, the question of sacrifice is mutually inconsistent, but we'll come back to that more later because these last couple of passages are outside the scope of what we're going to do today, just getting up to verse 21. So I'm going to leave the keywords up because there'll be times where it's helpful to be able to look back at the early part of the passage in the part that we're looking at today from verse 16 to 21. So after Saul had claimed that that here, as we saw up here, the people spared the best of the sheep and cattle to sacrifice to Yahweh your God. And that brings up the fact that this whole section here from 15 to 21 is shaped in a little chiasm around the repetition of this, which you can see right here. So it begins with Saul defending it in terms of sacrifice, and it ends in verse 21 with him defending it in terms of sacrifice. In the middle, as you can see, is both Samuel saying and Saul affirming that Yahweh sent him on a mission or on a way. And at the center is the very questions that Samuel presents here about listening and sacrifice that we'll get to. Samuel immediately says to Saul, stop. Heref here. It's only a couple of other times in 1 Samuel, as you can see. And then he tells Saul, I will tell you what Yahweh said to me last night. But this is a little bit tricky because all we heard was in verse 11, which does not include any of what Samuel actually says here. So let's go back a few verses and just listen to that for a second and compare it to what Samuel actually says to Saul. So this is all that Yahweh said to Samuel that we hear. I regret that I made Saul king, for he has turned back from following me. He has not carried out my commandments. Just that one sentence. Notice nothing about sacrifice, nothing about whether Saul is listening or not, nothing about his battles or what it is that he's turned back from following me in, since we saw at the end of chapter 14 that he'd certainly, his reign had been summarized as successful in terms of defeating or at least attacking in a strong way Israel's enemies. So that's all we know that Yahweh said directly. So now, do we believe Samuel that when he's reporting what he says now in verse 17 is Yahweh's words, or is it Samuel's words? And scholars are across the board on this. If we think of Samuel as a pious figure because he's in the Bible and because Yahweh was with him, then of course we're going to assume that all his words are in fact Yahweh's words. But we recognize as we've been going throughout this that Samuel has his own agenda, that his own emotions are often getting in the way, and his own sense of power gained and power lost in the establishment of the monarchy is certainly a factor raised here. Then we might be more suspicious of whether he's inserting his words here as Yahweh's words or not, especially in light of what follows in the verses after this that we'll look at in the next video or two as we finish this section. So he says, though you are little in your own eyes, and as Bodner notes, whenever Samuel starts with a question, it is not a good portent for Saul. The issue of being little in your own eyes is one of two echoes back to 1 Samuel 9:21. Let's go back and look at that because there's a couple important things to remember from there. So this is after Samuel has picked Saul and to make him king. We hear Saul's response. I am only a Benjamite from the least of the tribes of Israel, and my family is the humblest, or literally little or smallest, using the same kinds of words we see here. Why then have you spoken to me in this way? Notice also the families of the tribe of Benjamin, which will be important as we'll see in just a moment. So Saul's initial sense was that he was small, even though he was head and shoulders taller than everybody else. So when Samuel says, though you were little in your own eyes, we obviously know that Saul is tall. Is little in his own eyes a sign of Saul's modesty, or is Samuel being sarcastic here? Especially after he just heard the report that he was building monuments to himself. So we can certainly hear this as sarcastic. As somebody who's small in their own eyes is probably not building monuments to themselves, although if we wanted to psychologize about it, I'm sure we could come up with an explanation there, but I'll save that for somebody else's commentary. And then the further response is, are you not the head of the tribes of Israel? Notice, not king, Melech, or ruler, Nagid, but here just simply Rosh, head, and as tribes, as I was just noting, echoing echoing 9:21. So two echoes in this one sentence back to the initial encounter between Samuel and Saul over the question of monarchy. We have not heard tribes of Israel very, very often in here. Whether that means it's from a different sources, some scholars argue, and that shows up. I'll leave again for somebody else. And it says, Yahweh anointed you king over Israel. So, as my note below shows, only in 2 Samuel 12:7 in all of the books of Samuel is there the direct claim that Yahweh anointed anyone king. We'd already heard that Samuel was the one who anointed Saul king, and plainly it can't be literal, that Yahweh is not literally pouring oil over Saul as a human Samuel could do, but certainly highlighting that it's Yahweh's authority that he be king. And as we see, the earlier times it was as Nagid, it was as prince or ruler rather than as king. But there it is. And again, is this supposed to be Yahweh, Samuel quoting Yahweh? Because why would Yahweh speak about God's own self in the third person there? So Samuel's prefaces by saying, I will tell you what Yahweh told to me last night, but it's certainly sounding like the words of Samuel. And so he continues here in verse 18. And we ought to compare it to the original command, which we can see up here. So here is the command that he offers now. Yahweh sent you on a mission, but Bederek here, on a way, and said, go utterly destroy, using the harem word. Here we have the sinners, which we didn't hear before, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they were all consumed. And the phrase, till they're all consumed, literally, there is to perpetual completion. But what we saw earlier is Yahweh of hosts said, now go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have. Do not have mercy on them, but kill man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. So all that is left out here. We did not hear earlier that there was a Bederek, a mission, and we did not hear about sinners, although we certainly could understand that people who are opposing Yahweh are by definition sinners. But by putting that word in here, as Bodner notes, it's a loaded element, making the case against Saul as tight and condemnatory as possible in terms of saving sinners rather than destroying them. And so now, after having summarized what happens, Samuel continues this way. Why did you not listen to the voice of Yahweh? And in this listening example here, I translated all the uses of Shema as listen to. Sometimes in the translations in Norris V, we hear obey, sometimes hear, sometimes listen. So I translated them all consistently as listen, so we can see how often that comes up here. And so we're down here in 15:19. Why did you not listen to the voice of Yahweh? Why did you swoop down on the spoil? And as we've noted before, in 1432 came up, that's a verb from the noun ayat indicating bird of prey. And what that suggests is that Samuel understands, rightly, I think, that the troops' initial purpose of going down on the spoil was to eat it. Because as I showed you on the map, Amalek was a long way down, and the echo from 1432, which I'll go back to here, is certainly about eating it. The troops flew upon the spoil and took sheep and oxen and calves and slaughtered them. And the next verse, it's reported of Saul that the troops are sinning by eating the animals with the blood. And as I've noted previously in this section here, all the way to Amalek in a desert country, what else were they supposed to eat? It's not like they're going to forage in the forest there for food. There is no forest. So they had to eat, and there's no sense that Yahweh would prohibit them from eating like Saul foolishly did before the battle in the Philistines in chapter 14, which fortunately for them his son Jonathan ignored when he found the honey, and we know how that story went. So it certainly appears that the reason was for food. But what Saul has said was for sacrifice, and he will repeat that again in verse 21 here, seemingly trying to conform to what he understands as Samuel's concern, because Samuel had begun the relationship by telling him to sacrifice. And not only that, before he even met Samuel, he was told by the people that he met, the watering girls coming up from the city, the people have a sacrifice, and the people can't eat until Samuel must bless the sacrifice. So it's plainly not only that Samuel's not against sacrifice, he was in charge of the sacrifice. Now, one can certainly argue that Samuel simply saying, relatively speaking, isn't obedience or listening better than sacrifice. But he certainly seems to be objecting to the idea that the people swoop down on the animals for sacrifice. I wonder what would have happened if Saul had said, what I think is honestly, although the text is ambiguous, they swooped up on the spoil because they were hungry. And Samuel could certainly not condemn him for that. And ironically, right after our scene, when the encounter between Saul and Samuel is over, and Yahweh is setting Samuel on the course of finding David, the cover story he gives him to protect Samuel from being killed by Saul is to set up to say he's offering a sacrifice to Yahweh. So Yahweh, God's self, tells Samuel to offer a sacrifice, not because Yahweh wants a sacrifice, but because that would be an acceptable behavior among the people. So certainly starting at the beginning here in chapter 9 and the end of chapter 16, it's certainly totally normal that there would be a sacrifice. And we will see more sacrifice throughout the books of Samuel without any sense of condemnation. And yet it's characterized here, do what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Gilmore suggests here it's not the violation of Harem itself, to not spare Agag and the animals, but the disobedience of the command. But again, we have to be asking, is it really Yahweh's command, or was it Samuel's command? And the issue here, notice, is not about saving Agag here, but about the spoil taken by the people. It could certainly be easily argued that keeping Agag and sparing him was against what Yahweh wanted, to destroy the leadership of the Amalekites. But that's interestingly not what they discuss, even though it is mentioned here in verse 20 that we'll get to right now. So Saul said to Samuel, I have obeyed the voice of Yahweh. And one could listen to this in various tones that the text, of course, doesn't have. So Samuel charged him, why then did you not listen to the voice of Yahweh? And let's try 3 different angles. I have listened to the voice of Yahweh, so highlighting the obedience. I've listened to the voice of Yahweh, which is to say I've listened to Yahweh's voice and not necessarily your voice. So it could go either of those directions or perhaps another one. And the question is whether Saul is pushing back against Samuel or trying simply to conform and not admit that he had violated it. If he believes he violated, or perhaps he doesn't believe he violated. And he continues, I have gone on the mission, or on the way which Yahweh sent me. So he seems to directly refute both of the charges there. But notice the second sentence of the charge, why did you swoop down upon the spoil? He hasn't quite gotten to yet. He gets to that in verse 21. So he says, I have brought Agag, literally the hifal of the verb bo, to bring, much weaker than taken captive that we saw in verse 8. I have brought him, and that begs the question, why? Why has he brought him? What intention would Saul have to keep this king alive at this point? In previous situations like that in Judges, it's to kill them separately from the rest of the people, and sometimes to raise a pile of stones over them as a memorial. But that's not what is in mind here, at least not what's said, and certainly not what happens. So I have brought the king, Agag, king of Amalek, and I have utterly destroyed the Amalekites, which, as he noted, is plainly not the case, because they will return in chapter 30. But from the spoil, the people took sheep and cattle. So notice he notes in verse 20, I did these things. I have listened. I have gone on the mission. I have brought. I have utterly destroyed. But those doggone people took the sheep and cattle, the best of the things devoted to destruction. If he had stopped right there, apart from the fact that he already said basically the same thing in verse 15 as we saw in the chiasm, then he could still argue it's because they're hungry. But he doesn't go that way. He goes here, and using an unusual word, reshit here, which is literally the very first word in the Bible, in Genesis 1:1, the beginning, and we saw it once here. We could hear it as the beginning of the things devoted to destruction. But that's the best. It certainly works there as well. To sacrifice to the Lord your God. So for the second time here, and it'll be one more time, as we'll see, Saul disclaims that Yahweh is his God at all. And that would beg the question, if Saul's disclaimed that Yahweh is his God, who after all he's cried out to and Yahweh didn't respond, then why should he want to listen to that God at all, even though it says he's done it? And so we're going to stop there and pick up next time where Samuel picks up here around the question of sacrifice. And hopefully the issue that we were just looking at about the relation between sacrifice and listening will come together and really lead us one more time to question Samuel's motivations and Saul's response.